One of the biggest mistakes that most people make after buying a new camera is assuming that the camera itself will automatically create cinematic footage. The reality is, it's almost never the camera that's holding you back, it's the settings. The DJI Osmo Pocket 4P is an incredibly powerful little camera, but if you leave everything in auto mode, you're never going to get the best results. Today, I'm going to show you the exact settings that I use to create cinematic footage with the Pocket 4P. We're going to cover frame rate, shutter angle, ISO, ND filters, D-Log2, white balance, and a few simple habits that will instantly make your footage look more professional. By the end of the video, you'll have a repeatable setup that you can use every single time you go out and shoot. The first rule, turn off auto mode for everything. When everything is left on auto, the camera is constantly making decisions for you. The ISO changes, the shutter speed changes, and even the color temperature changes from shot to shot. That's why beginner footage often looks inconsistent, whereas professional looking footage is all about consistency. If every clip has a different exposure and different colors, the final video never feels polished. So before you do anything else, switch over to Pro mode and start taking control of your settings. Choose your frame rate first. Every cinematic setup starts with the frame rate because every other setting depends on it. For traditional cinematic footage, I almost always shoot at 24 frames per second. This is still the standard that movies have used for decades because it creates natural amount of motion blur that our eyes always associate with cinema. If I'm creating content specifically for social media or I want slightly smoother motion, I'll shoot at 30 frames per second. If I know ahead of time that I want slow motion footage, then I'll jump to 60 frames per second. And for a dramatic slow motion, I'll use 120 or even 220 frames per second. One mistake I see all the time is people shooting everything at 60 frames per second because they think higher numbers automatically means better quality. That's not necessarily true. If you're not planning to slow down the footage later, stick to 24 frames per second for your normal shots. The most important setting in filmmaking is shutter speed. This is where most people accidentally ruin the cinematic look. Now let's talk about the most important setting in filmmaking, shutter speed. This is where most people accidentally ruin the footage. There's a simple rule called the 180-degree shutter rule. The idea is that your shutter speed should be always double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you're setting your shutter speed to 1/50. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, 1/60. And if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you're shooting at 1/120. This creates natural motion blur. If your shutter speed gets too high, your footage starts looking overly sharp and choppy. It begins to look more like an action camera or a smartphone. If your shutter speed gets too low, your footage becomes blurry and soft. The sweet spot is what gives movies their familiar cinematic motion. Once you understand this rule, everything else starts to make sense. The next setting is ISO. It's a pretty simple rule. Keep it as low as possible. The lower the ISO, the cleaner your image will be. As ISO increases, digital noise starts appearing in your footage. During the daytime, I almost leave the ISO at 100. Around golden hour, I might increase it slightly to 200 or 400 if needed. But in indoors, I usually use 400 to 800, and that works well. At night, I try to stay below 1600 wherever possible. The 1-inch sensor inside the Pocket 4P performs surprisingly well in low light. But even the best cameras can look noisy if you push the ISO too far. So whenever possible, prioritize keeping a low ISO. Now we get to one of the most important filmmaking accessories that you'll ever buy, the ND filter. Think of ND filters as sunglasses for your camera. Remember that 180-degree shutter rule we just talked about? Here's the problem. During bright daylight, there is simply too much light entering the camera. And without an ND filter, the camera is forced to increase the shutter speed to compensate. And then suddenly your cinematic motion blur disappears. This is why ND filters are so important. My general setup is pretty simple. On cloudy days, I usually use ND8. On normal sunny days, I usually use ND16. And during bright midday sun, I'll jump to ND32. If I'm shooting in extremely bright conditions, an ND64 can be useful. But for me, I would suggest getting a variable ND filter. That way that you don't have to constantly change the lenses out. Next, let's talk about color profiles. If you want maximum flexibility when editing your footage, shoot in D-Log2. The first time you enable it, you'll probably think something is wrong because everything suddenly looks flat, gray, and washed out. That's completely normal. D-Log2 is designed to preserve more information both in highlights and shadows so you can color grade your footage later. Think of it like a digital negative. The benefit is that you have much more control in post-production. You can recover details, adjust colors more accurately, and create a more polished cinematic image. Now, if you don't enjoy editing or color grading, it's perfectly okay to stick with the standard profile. But if you're serious about filmmaking, learning D-Log 2 is absolutely worth the effort. They also have a color recovery mode where you can turn it on so you kind of see what the colors look like in your footage while you're filming. Lock your white balance. This is another simple setting that makes a huge difference. Turn auto white balance off. And this is one of the fastest ways that people make their footage look pretty amateur, is when the color temperature switches between clips. Instead, I manually set white balance depending on the environment. On sunny days, I usually set it as 5600 Kelvin. On cloudy days, around 6500 Kelvin. Indoors, between 32 and 4000. The exact numbers aren't as important as consistency. Locking white balance ensures all your shots match each other during editing. My everyday cinematic setup. So if I'm heading out the door, shooting a typical cinematic sequence, these are the settings I almost use every single time. I shoot 24 frames per second, my shutter speed set to 1/50, the ISO stays at 100 whenever possible. I enable D-Log 2, I lock my white balance manually, and then I attach an ND filter. It sounds simple because it is simple. Cinematic footage isn't one magical setting. It's a combination of small decisions that work together. Once you build these habits, the DJI Osmo Pocket 4P stops feeling like a tiny pocket camera and starts feeling like a legitimate filmmaking tool. Most people already own cameras capable of producing incredible footage. They just haven't learned how to unlock their full potential yet. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you learned something today. Please like, subscribe, follow for more tips and tricks, and stay tuned for the next one.